I want to tell you a story, all right? A priest and a taxi driver, they die and go to heaven, and they're brought before the pearly gates of heaven. Now, the taxi driver's first, and so the taxi driver steps up to where St. Peter is keeping the gates of heaven. And the taxi driver says, "My name is John Rankin, and I have been a taxi driver in Halifax for over 15 years. St. Peter, he looks down at his list, he looks up and he smiles and he says, "Welcome, Mr. Rankin. Receive this silken robe and this golden staff and enter the gates of heaven." And so the taxi driver joyfully enters into his glory. The priest steps up to St. Peter, and having seen the reward that the taxi driver is in himself excited. And so he booms, "My name is Father Simon Lobo. I have been the preacher at St. Benedict's Church for over 50 years. St. Peter, he picked up his list, he looks down, and he looks up, and he smiles. He says, "Welcome, Father Simon. Receive this woolen robe and this wooden staff." Father Simon said, well, wait a second. Why does the taxi driver get a better robe and a staff than me? I've spent my whole life dedicated to and serving the church. Well, St. Peter said, up here, we work by results. While the taxi driver drove, people prayed to God to save them. And while you preached, people fell asleep. All right. That's actually a story about me. Someone was telling me a few weeks ago that while they were listening to my homily, while I was preaching, someone started snoring behind them. So I'm just glad people can find a little rest here at St. Benedict on Sunday mornings, you know? But in this story, the priest, he's surprised by the criteria of judgment at the heavenly gates. And I think that one day, on our own day of judgment, we might all just be a little bit surprised. Now, many of us are allergic to that word judgment. We live in a society, a culture in which judgment, it's like a swear word. Like, oh, that person, they're so judgy, you know? We don't like the idea. We don't like the idea of being judged. We tell people not to judge other people. But here's the thing. There's no justice without judgment. And that there's injustice in the world doesn't take much to see. If we look into the world, we see all kinds of evil and injustices. We see all kinds of sickness and illness. We see starving children. We see poverty. We see abortion and racism and all kinds of prejudices. We see war and conflict. And we see terrible crimes committed on the news. There's injustice everywhere. And justice requires a judge. And a judge, and judgment requires a judge, excuse me. But here's the thing. On that day of judgment, when we're come before the throne of God, what's going to be on trial is not the evil out there somewhere committed by some evil institution. It's going to be what's in here. This is where the real evil happens. This is really where the judgment needs to occur. A writer, famous author, writer, his name was Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He was a critic of the Soviet communist regime. He spent time in the gulags, and he was a political prisoner. He witnessed some of the great atrocities committed by Soviet Russia. And he wrote this as he was reflecting on his time in the gulag. He said, "Gradually, it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states and between classes, nor between political parties either, but through every human heart and through all human hearts." It's not the evil out there in the world that is going to stand trial. It's the evil in here, in my own heart. It's going to be put on trial, and each of us will stand before the throne of God one day and be judged, for good or for bad. We profess this every day. After the homily, we stand up, we say the creed together, we say, He will come again to judge the living and the dead. We also, it's all throughout Scripture, we see it. Here's an example. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or evil. And on that day, God will set apart the holy ones, those who live lives of holiness, from those who haven't. Now, like the story at the beginning of the message, I think one day we all might just be a little bit surprised by the criteria of judgment. Now, this is our final week in our preaching series, Set Apart. We've been talking about the universal call to holiness, that whoever you are, if you're watching today, you're called to be holy, whether you're young or old, married or single, priest or religious or whatever. You are called to be holy. God has set you apart for himself. And so we've been talking about different ways to grow in holiness. And today I want to talk about, in the end, what sets us apart. So what is that criteria by which, in the end, before the judgment seat of God, we will be set apart? Well, Jesus paints that picture in the gospel today. So here's the scene. Christ the King, he comes at the end of time in history, and he gathers all the peoples and nations of the world before him. And what he does is he sets apart the sheep on his right side. Give me a bleat. Type it. Give me a sheep emoji. Give me a sheep emoji in the chat right now. So he sets the sheep apart on his right side, which is the side of favor, the side of honor, on the right side of the king. That's the position of honor. And he says to those sheep, he says, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." They are blessed, and God has prepared an eternal reward, a kingdom for them. They have been set apart. But why? What makes them blessed? Why are they set apart for this eternal reward? Well, Jesus says this: "When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was a stranger, you welcomed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. While I was sick, you took care of me. When I was in prison, you visited me." And the sheep, they're kind of confused. They're surprised as they're being judged for the actions that they did. They're surprised. They don't quite understand. And they say, "Lord, like, when did we do these things to you? Like, when did we see you naked? And when did we see you hungry? And when did we see you thirsty?" And Jesus says this: "Truly I say to you, just as you did it to the least of one of these members of my family, you did it to me." 5 words. You did it to me. Type that into the chat. You did it to me. You did it to me. Just as you did it to one of the very least of these, you did it to me. In other words, by serving those who suffered, you serve the King. Now, to the other group that he set apart, the goats that he put on his left side, those poor goats, he says, "You that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels." And we ask, well, why? And Jesus says, "When I was hungry, you did not feed me. When I was thirsty, you did not give me anything to drink. When I was a stranger, you did not welcome me. When I was naked, you did not clothe me. And when I was sick, You did not care me when I was in prison. You did not visit me. Whatever you did not do to the least of my brothers and sisters, you did not do to me. Now, here's the thing. This is really interesting because, I've heard lots of confessions over the years. And sometimes people may start by saying, well, I haven't murdered anyone. I haven't killed anyone recently. They start like that. But here's the thing. Jesus is not saying that. When we stand before the judgment seat of God, when we stand before Christ the King, who's enthroned in glory and power, he's not gonna exclude us, put us in the group of goats for having done terrible things. We think in our mind, maybe Hitler and Pol Pot, maybe Joseph Stalin, those guys, they're probably not going to make it, right? They're probably going to hell. But the rest of us, well, we're not murderers. We haven't done horrible things like that. But here's the thing. That's not the criteria by which Jesus is saying that he will judge. He is saying that the goats, those who are being excluded from heaven, are being excluded from heaven not because of something they did, but because of the good that they did not do. Because of their indifference. When they saw the people who suffered, when they saw hungry and lonely and tired people, and they ignored them, and they didn't do anything, and they stood there indifferently. When they neglected the suffering, they neglected the poor. And it's on that basis that they are set apart, that they are excluded from heavenly glory. You see, we will be set apart by the way we serve the suffering. We will be set apart by the way we serve the suffering. And when we serve the suffering, we serve the King. We serve the King when we serve the suffering. I'm going to tell you about a person who lived their life serving the suffering, serving the King in the suffering. Once upon a time, there was this girl named little Agnes Boyaju. Little Agnes lost her father unexpectedly, tragically, as a young girl. She was only 8 years old. And so she grew up without her father. And her family, without their primary breadwinner, which made it difficult for them. But despite that, Agnes's mother, Joanna, she always made space in her life, in her heart, in her home, in her finances for the suffering. Every night of the week, Joanna, Agnes's mother, would invite street people, would invite widows with no caretakers, would invite homeless, would invite mothers who've been ostracized from their families to eat with Joanna and her family, and she would feed them. Now, one day, Agnes was eating after dinner with all these people, always new people coming through the doors. Agnes asked her mother, she said, "Mom, who are all these people who are always coming to eat with us?" And Joanna said to Agnes, she said, "Some of them are our blood relatives, but all of them are our brethren. All of them are our brothers and sisters." And she said to Agnes, "My child, never eat a mouthful unless you are sharing it with others." And from that time on, a deep concern impressed itself upon Agnes for the poor and the suffering. Now, Agnes grew up, and at the age of 18, she became a religious sister. She became a Loretto sister. But at the age of 38, 20 years later, she experienced this particular call to serve the suffering. And so she donned a white sari, a blue and white sari, and she went into the slums of Calcutta. You may know her better as Saint Teresa of Calcutta. She wandered into the slums without any money, without any plan, without knowing anybody, and her only purpose was to serve the most poor and suffering people that she could find. She founded the Missionaries of Charity, who have established hospitals and schools and orphanages and homes for the dying all around the world. Now, one time, St. Teresa was being followed by a reporter who was doing a story on her life and her ministry. And the reporter watched as St. Teresa was walking through one of her homes, and she stopped to kneel down next to a leper. And this leper had maggot-infested wounds. Mother Teresa, she washed those wounds, and then she kissed the leper. And later on, the reporter asked her, she said to Mother Teresa, she said, "Mother, I would not do that for $1 million. Do you know what Mother Teresa said? She said, "Neither would I." Yeah. She didn't do it for money. She didn't do it for fame or success. She did it to serve the King. Because she recognized in all the suffering, the King of Kings, that Jesus himself is in the suffering and the poor. And her only desire is to serve the King. She would later, people would often ask her, like, "Mother, why is it that you love the poor so much?" Mother Teresa would take the hand of the person who asked them. She would begin wiggling their fingers. And she said this, "You did it to me. You did it to me." See, in her mind, the whole gospel message of Jesus could be summarized in those 5 words. You did it to me. Her only desire was to serve Jesus and to encounter him in the most poorest and destitute people of the world. Now, at St. Benedict, we believe that all of us are called to serve. That it's one of the hallmarks of discipleship. As followers of Jesus, it's our duty, it's our responsibility, it's our right to serve others. And we try to make all kinds of opportunities for people to serve. And previous to COVID, we had over 80 different ministries, and many of those, in a particular way, serve the poor, serve the needy, serve the suffering. And, none of us are called to be St. Teresa and leave everything and wander into the slums of Calcutta. Maybe somebody out there is. None of us can do everything, but all of us can do something for somebody in need. Mother Teresa said, if you can't feed 100 people, just serve one. Just feed one person. We have a place on our website that you can sign up if you want to serve in some way, if you want to serve some of the suffering. We have all kinds of ministries. We have a website where we've just put a few of them. Some that we know are active during this time in COVID. You can check it out, stbenedict.ca/outreach. You can also get there by clicking the serve button at the top of our website. There's just a few there, different ways you can connect and get involved if you're interested. But here's the thing. We all have suffering people in our life. Mother Teresa, she said, never worry about numbers. Sometimes we can get overwhelmed with the reality, the scope of suffering in our world. She said, never worry about numbers. Help one person at a time. And always start with the person nearest you. So who is the person nearest you that's suffering today? You might just ask the Lord, say, Lord, open my eyes to see the suffering people in my midst, that I might serve you in them. See, in the end, we will be set apart before the throne of Christ the King for the way we either served the King in the suffering or we neglected him. And we serve so great a King. We serve a King who, though he was rich beyond comprehension, who dwelled in untold riches and glory and splendor, this rich King became poor so that we who are poor might become rich in grace and life and salvation. We worship a king. We follow a king who is not distant and dwells in gilded halls of power, distant from the realities of his subjects, but who himself took on the poverty of his subjects so that he might raise us to new life in him. We serve a king who took upon himself all the suffering of the world so that he might be with the most broken and the poorest and the most suffering among us. This is the king that we follow, a king who suffered for us. And when we serve the suffering, we serve this king. So let's serve the suffering and so be set apart.